Welcome to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I am speaking with our special guest, Shawn Coyne. Shawn, welcome to the summit.
Oh, thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate being here and anything I can do to help.
Shawn, in this summit, we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of writer's craft. We're going to be looking at story structure. We're going to be looking at uh, causality between scenes. We're going to be looking at character and all these different fundamentals of writing. But I think there's this question for beginners sometimes, that's why? Why do I need to follow the rules? Why do I need to learn the fundamentals? And in your incredible book, The Story Grid, which I recommend everyone go and pick up, you present something called the story bell curve. And I feel like the bell curve is a wonderful explanation for why craft matters. So that's what I'd like to dig into in this session with you today.
Great, great. That makes a lot of sense.
So let's explain for people, what is the bell curve? What is this thing?
Well, I'm going to have to just take a tiny step back and sort of address the question about why people have to learn structure. And the key part for me is, if we were to sort of look at, say, a bird, and we were to sort of put together all the sort of characteristics of a bird. It has wings, it has a beak, it eats seed, it eats worms, it can fly, etc. All of that stuff is very interesting, but if we were to build a machine that had all of those parts, it still wouldn't be a bird, right? So there's something about the sort of internal organizational structure of the bird that makes it a bird. And it's the same sort of thing with a story. Now, a story has many different components, but the organizational structure is, it's very important that you understand how to begin to put that into the work. And that's what craft is all about. It's about learning the organizational structure of a story, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and all of the things that go with that, so that when you are actually in the moment writing the work, you have this craft available to you at your fingertips. So it's almost as if, you get this, the more you work on your craft, the less you have to worry about it as you're writing. So when we're amateurs and when we're beginning and when we're passionate about storytelling, we can fall into big quicksand holes very quickly. And the thing that sort of ripped me out of those holes was to be able to sort of take a big giant leap back and say, well, what is the organizational structure of a story in and of itself? Why do we have these things in the first place? And how can I make my mind better by understanding the purpose of what a story is for? So to get to the bell curve, the story bell curve is really a way of looking at story through the prism of sort of what I call, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, so the reason why we have stories is so that we can adapt to the world and the environment. So, the very first stories were action stories. There were stories about survival. If you avoid this path to the food, you won't be eaten by a tiger. And those were the drawings on caves were the first sort of narrative structure of stories. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which Abraham Maslow was a psychologist in the middle part of the last century, he came up with this really brilliant pyramid of needs, which he said it was a hierarchy. So at the very bottom, the needs that you have to take care of are things like food, shelter, water, all those sort of primal needs just to survive. And then when you move up the hierarchy, it moves into sort of safety needs, which means like you've got to have a safe place so you can sleep. You've got to have a safe arena so that you can, recharge yourself. And then and so on and so forth. So what I've sort of put together is I've matched Maslow's hierarchy of needs with sort of the 12 content genres that I talk about in the story grid. So, I was thinking to myself, well, if we were to map out kind of what kind of story can satisfy and interest the largest audience? How would we go about doing that? And I thought to myself, well, it would probably come out in a bell curve shape, which is the traditional sort of like when a bunch of people take a test in a class, it usually comes out into a bell curve, right? So at the very, at the very start of the bell curve, we have very few people who don't do very well at all. So on a test of 100, they get 6 points correct, they get 10 points, 20 points. And then slowly, as we rise up, more people are in the middle, and they get about the average, which is probably between 60 to 80 points, right? So that's sort of like the middle grades, and this is how we get grades in school, right? You have your D, your C, your B, and then at the very top, we have those who score very, I'm sorry, and as the curve is moving, and at the very tail end of it, you have the people who get 100 and 99. These are the outliers. So you have outliers on this side of the bell curve, and you have outliers on this side of the bell curve, and then the meaty middle is where pretty much everybody falls, right? So the bell curve, I'm thinking, with our 12 content genres, I bet there's one primal one that satisfies that biggest, thickest spot. And I think it's true, and I think it's the action story. And the action story are things like Marvel Comics movies, big blockbuster tentpole events that, the life value at stake is life and death, right? So in the middle, you have sort of the action story, and then you start to peel off with other kinds of genres. I'm just pulling up my, I can't remember all the things that I've written, so sometimes I have to take notes here, Kevin. All right, so after you have action in the middle, then you would have things like the crime story, the mystery story, which concerns justice and injustice. And then you would have war, horror, thriller, all those things that deal with what? Safety, right? So action is the primal, things about life and death. Can they survive the tornado? Can, Superman turn the axis of the earth so that he can go back in time and save Lois Lane? That sort of thing. And so as you peel off from that, then you're going to look at the genres that deal with safety. And those safety genres are crime, war, horror, Western, and thriller. Okay. So then you come down a little bit more and you have the next level, which is sort of the meaty, like juiciest level, which is the love story. Now, the love story is across gender. Everybody loves a great love story. And love story, by the way, is also a great choice for a subgenre. So if your global genre is crime, if you dump in a little bit of love story there, you can broaden the audience. And as you move further and further from that meaty middle, you get into the more contemplative genres, like the worldview maturation plots and things of that sort that aren't going to speak to everyone, but they will have very targeted, strong markets. So the bell curve is really about, it's a very sort of not very laser focused, but it's a big sort of general principle to guide people when they're thinking about what kind of story that they want to write. So if you want to write a story that is not, doesn't really have a through line linear time space, and things just happen willy-nilly and it's really difficult to understand, it's sort of like a meta postmodern novel, you're looking at the tail end of that sort of story bell curve. So if you're going to write that, cool. But just understand there isn't really going to be much of a market for that story because you're speaking to the outlier readership that likes really great intellectual, sort of puzzles. And similarly, if you're writing a story that concerns, multiple characters, that doesn't really have much at stake and is more of a, slow burn, again, you're going to look at the outlier on the other side, which is mini plot, multiple character with not much at stake. So if, in the story grid book, I described these certain characteristics in much more detail, but globally, that's really what the story grid, uh, bell curve is all about.
Yeah, yeah. And so if people are wondering about the axes, so you've got the y-axis is level of popularity
Yes.
or potential audience, and then your was that y, and then your
Yes.
x is type of story. And so what you do in the book is you kind of group them into three big plots.
Yes.
So as you said, the mini plot, which has certain characteristics, the arch plot, which is the one that's most popular that we talked about, and then the anti-plot on the other side. And what I think is so key about this is each of those types of stories has very specific characteristics.
Yes.
Well, do you want to dig into that a bit? Let us know some of the key characteristics
Sure.
of a arch plot versus a mini plot.
Okay. So I'm just citing my notes here, so don't think I'm not paying attention. All right. So all right. So let's begin with the mini plot, which is on the far left-hand side of our graph. Okay. And so the first thing is that the inciting incident of these stories isn't so large. So it's not like a hurricane comes and everybody has to find shelter. It's more like somebody gets disappointed because they didn't get the birthday gift that they wanted. Like not massive, big stakes here. The second thing is that it's an inconsistent reality. And what that means is that it can sort of shift time periods, like something like The French Lieutenant's Woman, which was a famous novel in the 1970s by John Fowles. It moves between sort of a historical time period and contemporary life. So it's not a consistent reality. We're moving around time, which makes it a little bit more difficult to follow. So it's an inconsistent reality. The third one is that it's a non-linear time period. So the timing, it's like Pulp Fiction, right? In Pulp Fiction, it moves all over in time. And part of the fun of watching Pulp Fiction is trying to figure out, wait a minute, Vince Vega is here, and then what happens, and where's that? And it's a really great, I mean, Tarantino combines so many different genres in Pulp Fiction. It's just a brilliant piece of work. But okay, so it's nonlinear. The fourth one is that the conflict, the central conflict of the story is internal. So the characters are all concerned about whether or not they are living up to the standards that they wish to live up to on a moral high ground, or they're maturing, or they're learning something about themselves that they weren't aware of before. So all the conflict is very much in the minds of the characters, as opposed to somebody with a gun, right? That would be external conflict. Multi-protagonist, right? So you're going to have multiple characters who are dealing with thematically similar events, who have sort of different subjective worldviews. So when somebody like, there's a Raymond Carver, who's a great short story writer. They made a movie of a bunch of his short stories called Shortcuts. Robert Altman made it. And it's a really interesting take on a number of Carver short stories. And thematically, these characters are all dealing with the difficulties of navigating, modern society. So we get to see this, and it's all in Los Angeles. So we get to see this big picture. There was another movie some time ago about multiple characters dealing with strangeness in Los Angeles too. I think that's a thematic story. Anyway, so it's multi-character. Okay, the protagonists, the multi-protagonists are passive. So things happen to them and then they react, as opposed to them actively trying to change themselves. They're passively sort of sitting back, conflict hits them, and they're forced to change. So that's a really big, important thing too. They're passive. And lastly, at the end of the story, nothing is really fully resolved. So it's an open ending. So you could see how, if you're in a certain mood for this kind of story, they're great, right? But you kind of have to get yourself in a mood for it. And it's not as popular as something like the Arch Plot, which let me just, run through now.
Well, just before you
Go
dig
ahead.
into the Arch Plot, I just like to think of Mrs. Dalloway as maybe a great example
Yeah.
of the mini plot, right? Where you've got, time is squishy, multiple perspectives, very internal, not a lot of active object of desire, drive, not a lot of closure. So that's where and yet a masterpiece in my mind.
Yes.
But it's never gonna be as popular as the Hunger Games, right?
Right.
Like that's the point of the bell curve. Mrs. Dalloway is an absolute masterpiece, but it will never be as popular as the Hunger Games because those very clear characteristics that you just outlined that make up the mini plot.
Well, just to speak, you're absolutely right about Mrs. Dalloway. That's a perfect example of mini plot. And there's a phrase in Hollywood that they use, which is called the 4-quadrant, movie. The 4-quadrant movie is dad will go see it, mom will go see it, and the kids will go see it, and maybe they'll all go together, right? So if you can get those 4 quadrants in the film, the audience potential is much higher, right? So Mrs. Dalloway is a brilliant novel by Virginia Woolf, and also it's a brilliant film, right? But as a film, it's maybe got 1 or 2 quadrants, but Hunger Games has all 4, right? So if you look at it in terms of Hollywood 4 quadrants, potential audience, then the story grid bell curve will make even more sense. But you're absolutely right. That's a great way of, and Hunger Games is a great example of an arch plot, right? So let me just go through the arch plot stuff now.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so in the arch plot, there's a big event causality, right? So in Hunger Games, it's the big event that causes everything, that incites the entire story, is each, 2 kids from every community have to be picked for this contest. Katniss is the protagonist. Her sister is picked, but she's allowed to substitute for her sister. So right off the bat, we know a lot about this character, right? She has the courage to put herself in harm's way to save her sister. So immediately we're sympathetic to her. And it's a big, big event. Okay, the second thing is it's a consistent reality, right? So the Hunger Games reality is a world that is unique. It's fantasy world. It's post-apocalyptic, but it's consistent. We know there are rules. There are certain things that happen. There are certain communities. It's all very clear, and we can sort of suss it out. And if somebody were to ask us questions about it, we would be able to answer them. So it's a consistent reality throughout. The third one, linear. So it's linear in time. Once she gets picked, then we follow her all the way through until the end of the Hunger Games. External conflict, right? So she's literally, her life is at stake. They're trying to kill her. It's a brilliant, nobody gets confused about the Hunger Games. She has to kill or be killed. It's that difficult. Single protagonist. Katniss is our number one, right? We're watching her from the beginning. We attach ourselves to her. We feel her pain. Active. She actively pursues her goal, which is to win the Hunger Games. So she's constantly thinking of new tools, new things to do, and enacting those tools in order to win the contest. Closed ending. Now, of course, there are sequels to the Hunger Games, but it's pretty closed at the end. She survives, and so does her friend, right? And it's a brilliant twist at the end that allows them to survive. But at the end, we feel, oh, thank God that's over. It's closed. So it's a very clear experience for the reader or the viewer in that you're signing up for an extended period of time. There's going to be a beginning, middle, and end. And it's going to be clear at the end what happened, and you're going to be able to breathe a sigh of relief at the end. So that's the arc plot.
And I think what's so brilliant here is the dissonance I see is, as a writing coach, when clients come to me and they say, I want to write the next Harry Potter, I want to write the next Hunger Games, but I want to have 7 main characters instead of 1.
Mm.
And I want to tell it out of order. And I want it to be really more of an internal struggle than an external struggle. And so what I find the bell curve so helpful in explaining is all those characteristics that person wants to have in their story are fine, but you're moving your story down the bell curve. When you do that, you can't say you want to hit the top of the bell curve and hit all 4 quadrants of the Hollywood target and all that and
Right.
be the next Harry Potter, while also invoking all the characteristics of the mini plot, right? There needs to be alignment between the elements of craft that you're employing or deploying in your story and the target audience that you're going after.
That's a really great point, Kevin. And the other thing that I hear a lot is, well, the Lord of the Rings has multiple characters and they're all, but really, it's really about Frodo, isn't it? I mean, isn't Frodo, if you had to, bring Tolkien back from the dead and ask him really who's the core character, it's Frodo. And he changes irrevocably by the end of the story. So you're absolutely right. And using the story grid bell curve to explain that to people is really, I haven't actually done that myself. So to hear you're doing it is great. And that's really great.
I think something really interesting that you dig into in the book as well is you actually explain why the arch plot is so attractive. And your argument is that the experience of the arch plot of the hero's journey is the story we tell ourselves about our own lives. We tell ourselves that life has causality and that it's teleological and that we are the hero and that
Yeah.
there are antagonists out there putting great challenges before us. And that's why these types of stories are so popular.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the hero's journey is the meta myth. It's the myth above all myths. It's cross-cultural. Carl Jung did years and years of research on it. So did Joseph Campbell. A lot of people say to me like, "Oh, I think that's cheesy. I don't believe in the hero's journey anymore." And it's sort of it doesn't make any sense to me because it's absolutely the way our worldview comes from our culture, and the culture has passed down the heroic journey for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So to understand the heroic journey as arch plot is a really big key to helping you fix your story once you've started. So there are 12 stages in the hero's journey, and they equate with the beginning hook, the middle build, and the ending payoff. And if you track them and make sure that you've got everything sort of aligned in the way that the heroic journey is commences, then you can breathe a sigh of relief and know, well, I think at the very least people are going to be sympathetic to this character and they're going to understand what they're going through. But if you deny that the hero's journey is a palpable, really a powerful road guide, I think you're gonna find yourself in the third section of our story grid bell curve, which I think has the smallest audience, and it's also, for better or for worse, over the last since after World War II, it's become the sort of ivory tower intellectual kind of story that MFA programs and high-end literary people believe is the most powerful story. And I would absolutely disagree, but it's the anti-plot story. And the anti-plot story is, again, I mentioned it in the book, it's a reaction to the complete nonsensical nature of World War II, the power of evil, nobody really understood why it happened or how it could happen again. And so people started to have this postmodern feeling about it. And they said, well, maybe there isn't anything meaningful anyway in the world. Maybe we're living in a meaningless universe and it's indifferent and who cares? So this is sort of the birth of the anti-plot story, which just to go through the, the characteristics, everything happens in coincidence in an anti-plot story. So there's no causality at all. So somebody walks down the street, a piano falls on them, and we don't know why or how or whatever. The second is that it's an indeterminate reality. Jean-Luc Godard is like a classic anti-plot hero from the French New Wave, and he did a story years ago where, it's set up where somebody's walking through the woods, and it's a contemporary story, and all of a sudden they run into Jane Austen or something, and
Yeah.
she comes out of the past, and it just doesn't make any sense, and it's an inconsistent reality, and it's kind of baffling. The third one is it's indeterminate time period. So we don't know, is this the present day? Is this the past? Is this the future? And it gets very, very wonky and weird. It's indeterminate conflict. We don't even know what people want from each other or if they're angry or whatever. So the conflict isn't even very clear. And lastly, there's two more. All right, we don't even know who the protagonist is. It's an indeterminate protagonist, right? And the other thing is that we don't even know if it ended or not, right? It could just stop, and that's the end of the movie or the end of the novel, and we're like, is that the end, or are there pages I'm missing? Did I not get a signature in the book or whatever? And, I really have... I don't really buy into the anti-plot thing, because the way I see it is it gives people license to be lazy, right? It gives them a license to say, well, there is no fundamental organizational structure in the story, so I'm not going to put any in. And stories are lies. And the hero's journey is a lie, and the way we look at the world is a lie. And it all becomes very meta. It all becomes very intellectually ridiculous.
Yeah, I think like on the formal side, it's easy to see it anti-plot getting very empty, but you bring in a really interesting political angle in the book when you point out that because the arch plot is so powerful, it's how we understand our lives, but it's also how we teach people to behave in society, that
Mhm.
the arch plot, it's what Marvel Comics is doing in the movies, but it's also the storytelling method of tyranny.
That's right.
I have that line underlined in your book, and I was like, whoa, that's powerful stuff. And so it's really interesting to think of anti-plot as a political pushback against kind of the misuse of the arch plot.
Well, yeah, that's a really yeah, I forgot I had written that, but that's absolutely, I would agree with myself. And if you want to look at it from sort of a big mythological point of view, the arch plot is very ordered, right? There's a real strong narrative order in the arch plot, which follows the heroic journey, and it can be among any of the content genres, right? So the arch plot is the prototypical representation of the ordered world, and anti-plot is the prototypical representation of chaos, where we don't understand what's going on, nor is it seemingly possible that we ever will. So if you look at something like Waiting for Godot, which I think is a brilliant masterwork, one of only a few that I would really sing praises to in the anti-plot world, that is dealing with the condition of chaos. So the anti-plot is in many ways the reaction to the order of the arch plot. So, not to get too political about it, but let's just go back into the Third Reich. There was a really interesting story that people bought into in Germany that was an arch plot, and it was a very compelling arch plot that was completely wrong and evil. So order, when it is manipulated, soon becomes tyranny. So I think for writers today to think about, well, how do I bring in chaotic moments into the story that will make it that the character will actually have to refresh their worldview, right? So the thing about the heroic journey is that there's a revelatory moment for the hero. There's a moment when the hero realizes that the toolbox that they've used their entire life is no longer going to solve this big problem. And so they reach a point of no return, an all is lost moment, and they have to refresh themselves. They have to innovate in their minds a way to get out of a very difficult situation that is seemingly impossible to get out of. It very much mirrors the writer's journey, right? So the writer, when we craft a story, we get very confident at the beginning. And we say to ourselves, yeah, well, I totally have this all mapped out. It's going to be perfect. And then inevitably at midpoint, you hit an all is lost moment and you go, I don't even know why I'm writing this thing. I should really just give up and quit. So the heroic journey of the story is reflective of the writer's journey as they're writing it. And that's why writing is such a potent way of self-examination, in a way that you're not literally self-examining, you're, quote unquote, coming up with brand new fantasies. But you are in fact examining. So as you're writing, when you do hit that all is lost moment, you're forced to innovate, to come up with a different twist, and so is the character. So if you look at the heroic journey as a process by which the character attains wisdom as opposed to manipulates people, then I think you can stay on the true course of having people engage with your story without manipulating them to believe a lie.
The thing that I love about all of this is you kind of encapsulate it really nicely in a sense in the book, where you say what the bell curve really comes down to is it about knowing what you want to say and then understanding the best way to say it. And so I think that's such a great start to this summit, because we're going to look at so many different aspects of writing. And I think this conversation has been a great foundation and groundwork to set people up to say, okay, there isn't necessarily an easy answer for how to develop character. You need to understand what your goals are as
Right.
an author, what audience you're going after, what it is you have to say about the world, and then pick the techniques, pick the tools, pick the templates that work best for the story you want to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I think, one of the things I always talk about is toggling between the macro and the micro. So whenever you get confused when you're writing a scene, it's a good idea to step back and say, oh, why am I writing this book in the first place again? Sort of take yourself, 10,000 feet above the work for a minute and say, what am I trying to relate here? I'm talking about, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering stuff. It can be something as simple as, I'm writing this novel to explain how difficult it is raising children, right? Something that simple, and it's a very compelling idea, because anyone who has children will certainly want to buy that book, right? Because they're going to feel like, oh yeah, it's finally someone has stated the pain. So if you go up there and then you're having trouble with the scene, then you can always say to yourself, okay, why am I writing this? Oh, it's for people to understand how difficult it is to raise children. Okay, and what's my scene here? Oh, my scene really doesn't seem to have any conflict about the wants and needs of the children who are at stake in the story. Oh, that's my problem. maybe I should really focus on trying to add that to this scene. So toggling between the macro and the micro is a great way of getting yourself out of the weeds. And when you're beginning the process, really taking a very large, bell curve kind of point of view to get yourself aligned so that you can start to sort of focus and narrowly get to the place where you want to be is a great idea. So I'm really glad that the story bell curve is helpful for that. And, I wish you the best of the fortune with the summit. And it sounds like a great project.
Thanks so much, Shawn. When I first interviewed you for my podcast, it was almost 5 years ago, I think now. It was just
Wow.
before a Story Grid book came out. And you said something during that interview that I ended up putting into the theme song, kind of the opening theme song thing of the podcast. And you said something, I'm paraphrasing, but you said, basically, when you know something, you have a responsibility to share that knowledge with others. And that has always stuck with me. And I think that's been a bit of a touchstone and some guiding advice for me over the last 5 years as I've built my coaching businesses, as I've worked with authors. I've always had Shawn Coyne in the back of my mind saying, like, this is your business, but this is also your moral responsibility. This is your way of improving the world. So I just want to thank you so much for all, for your book, for all the amazing work you do, for all the support you've given me over the years. And I just thank you, because that concept of sharing knowledge is what this summit is all about. And we're going to have 25 different people on here because they care about story, they care about helping authors. And so I just want to thank you so much for laying that groundwork with this discussion.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Wow, that's really great to hear. Really appreciate the sentiments.